lovely question from a member of the Frustration Masterclass today, which gives me some scope, some lovely scope, to probe the variety that can be inherent in canine frustration, and our frustration as well, and whether anxious behaviours are they less varied? It's such a great question. So just how flexible is frustration? She'd noticed that her dog Buddy, he's got much more consistent behaviours when he seems to be anxious, when he's feeling a little bit anxious. But where she sees him frustrated, there's a lot more variety, there's a lot more flexibility. So she wanted to know, is there anything that's behind this observation? Is there reality behind that? Shall we find out? I really think we should. So hi, I'm Emma, I'm a canine behaviour consultant. I help people, and I help dogs too, I help people though whose dogs have all the big feelings. Frustration is definitely one of those big feelings that I'm interested in and I see every day in my work. These days I'm so sensitized to frustration that I just feel like I could spot it blindfold. I could smell it even, I can smell that frustration. So it's sensible to start by saying that whether and how you divide frustration and anxiety, how you split them up, it just depends on your school of thought. And it's a frequent question in the Frustration Masterclass. Is this frustration? Is it anxiety? Is it something else? Can it be both? And are they really so separate emotions? Are they such separate emotions? So what might that look like? And it feels so easy, doesn't it? It feels so easy to say that frustration and anxiety are different emotions. Of course they are, Emma. Of course they're different emotions, Emma. What a stupid thing to say, I hear you saying. As if they weren't different, we wouldn't actually need different words for them. And we know frustration feels different than anxiety. I mean, who doesn't know the difference, the feeling between anxiety and frustration? And yet actually, when it comes to our dogs and even to ourselves, it's not always so clear cut. And I can give you plenty of situations where you might have experienced yourself, where you might be hard pressed to say whether you actually felt anxious or whether you felt frustrated or you felt some deliciously awful cocktail of the two. So think about your typical dog on lead in the park. It's such a typically frustrating situation. As soon as they see another dog, they're there, your dog's there, barking their heads off. And if they're off lead, maybe they just run straight over to the other dog, they engage in a quick round of play, maybe they just dive straight in like an incoming missile, they do their stuff, they're also stereotypical, saying hi, and then they run off again. Is this anxiety? Is it frustration? Can it be both? If you know me, you already know my answer to this. It depends. It depends entirely on the dog. A fair few dogs who I work with, they engage in what I like to call trial by ordeal, or sometimes bum rushing if I'm being less polite. They love to race up to dogs who they don't know, they get in their face a little bit, and then they go on the rest of their walk. So, does this mean though that behaviour is rooted in anxiety, in frustration, in friendliness, in sociability? So for me, I see this behaviour, an awful lot of this behaviour is actually just rooted in uncertainty. Uncertainty brings anxiety along with it as a bit of kind of emotional support, if you will, handy emotional support. Not knowing whether something is good or maybe not good, it can certainly cause you concern. It can cause you that anticipatory feeling of what we might think of as anxiety. But that uncertainty can also bring frustration if your attempts to resolve that anxiety are thwarted in typical frustration style. For our dogs barking in the park, they're not sure if the other dog is a friend, if they're a foe. So one way to resolve that anxiety with an unfamiliar dog, just cut that anxiety that comes with the uncertainty, just to race up to the other dog, to tear the metaphorical plaster off, then you've got certainty. Phew, social time, that bomb is diffused. But if our dogs are unable to use this tried and tested approach, it can then be very frustrating. So if they can't do what they want to do all of the time, it can be very frustrating. And that's why I say it's not easy to distinguish between anxiety and frustration, even if you think you know these emotions really well and you really think that you can recognize them in your dogs. So our dog's learning history may also be adding to that uncertainty as to whether it's frustration or anxiety. If nothing bad ever happens when they do that, there's no reason for them to stop doing it. And the more they rely on this bum rushing, this trial by ordeal, the more they need to do that behaviour. It's their coping mechanism. And that means it's additionally frustrating if you're there and you put the lead on them, you're making it impossible for them to carry out that coping strategy, to reduce their uncertainty, to reduce their concern. So whatever this behaviour is, whether it's indeed rooted in frustration, whether it's rooted in anxiety, I know one thing, this is incontroversial. To race up to an unknown dog, a potentially hostile, unfamiliar dog, a dog often much bigger than you, a dog who may be giving out all signs of discomfort and displeasure, it relies on social skills of the other dog. I find it is such an offensive behaviour. And those dogs are really lucky a lot of the time. I can't tell you how many dogs have raced up to my dog Liddy, and they are very, very lucky that she is muzzled, that she's on the lead, that I've got my eyes open. When you're 5 times smaller than the grumpy or the over-aroused or the antisocial dog that you're bum rushing, and they're telling you they don't feel comfortable with it, things can go very wrong in that situation. So many people confuse this behaviour with canine friendliness, with sociability, with having a need or a drive to play, a need to socialise, that we can understand just how much harder it is to define clearly those differences between one unpleasant emotion, frustration, and another unpleasant emotion, anxiety, because we're not that good at distinguishing between an unpleasant emotion, whatever's going on, and a pleasant emotion. So if I hear it's okay, they're friendly, as a tiny barking dog races over to me and Liddy, the one thing I know is they're not friendly. They're anxious perhaps, they're frustrated perhaps, they're angry maybe, I don't know. They're very poor at risk assessment, that's a definite. And I see there's so many people who just can't tell that their dog is definitely not as friendly as they say they are. And that makes it even more likely that we humans may find it harder to distinguish between two unpleasant, two negative emotions, if we really struggle to tell the difference between a pleasant emotion and an unpleasant one, between good emotions and between bad emotions. So how then can we tell the difference between these two if we're not so good at telling them between other ones which you'd think would be more obvious? And also, does frustration come with more variety? Might that variety actually be a good way to tell the difference between anxiety and frustration? So people often think that anxiety is about avoidance, that if we're worried about something, if we're concerned about it, we just avoid it. Right? Like, if I'm worried about how big my tax bill is going to be, I'm just going to put it off, surely. And if I'm not sure, like, my trousers from last summer are going to fit me this summer, then I'm just going to put it off a little while. I'm going to delay that trial. I'm going to put it off as long as I can. So we typically think of anxiety being with avoidance behaviours. But anxiety is also about uncertainty. And one way to resolve uncertainty and anxiety is just to move to certainty. So I'm perhaps one of those rare individuals, I don't know about you, I declare my income in the first week of the tax year because I like to know just how big my bill is going to be. I don't want it to be a surprise. And even if it's going to be huge, and even if I don't have the means to pay it yet, I'd rather know what it is at the outset, and then I feel comfortable. I know, it might be awful and dreadful, but I don't have to worry about what it might be anymore. So I've ripped the plaster off, and it's resolved my anxiety. So anxiety isn't always about avoidance behaviours. It's also not about avoidance in social situations either, always. It can be really hard to avoid social situations for social species like dogs and humans. And so how we behave in social situations can actually be different when we're anxious than how we'd behave around, say, a seashore if we've got some kind of trauma memory from our parents like letting us watch Jaws when we were far too young to cope with the horror of it all. So it's very easy to avoid sharks by refusing to go on the seashore or going in the sea. It's not so easy to avoid social situations, especially when you're a social species, especially if you have to live with or work with or be with the person or people or the other individuals who make you anxious or afraid. And the exact same thing is true for our dogs. So it can be very easy to avoid non-social threats, but it can be much harder if we have to live in the same home as a human being or another animal even who gives us cause for concern, maybe from time to time. It probably isn't all the time. So that means that we may actually rely on different behaviours depending on different situations in which we'd feel slightly concerned or worried or afraid. I've got a colleague, Claire, who quite frankly, I hope she never watches this, is a little bit terrifying because she is so good at what she does, and she's fierce and she's expressive and she's wonderful. I don't avoid Claire like I might avoid a spider in the bathroom, but I'm not underestimating my fears of Claire. But I bring out all of my own appeasement behaviours, like I'm always cracking jokes at my own expense around Claire. I'm always telling her that I'm halfway terrified of her. I'm very honest about my fears of her. That we may use different strategies to reduce anxiety. I'm not going to try and appease a shark, am I? We might be reducing anxiety in different situations in different ways, meaning that anxious behaviour, that can be pretty varied, pretty flexible too. I see this with my own dog, Liddy. She is very uncertain about some people, especially, and not surprisingly, tall, confident, fast-moving, decisive individuals of the male adult persuasion. And if she doesn't know them and she doesn't have to live with them, she's doing what I would call her best, like steer clear behaviours, like keep away behaviours. But with my brother, who is a tall, confident, fast-moving, decisive individual of the male adult human species, and she seems to like his company very much, I would say, but she's relying on different behaviours altogether in those situations where she's not quite sure to reduce her concern. So with my brother, she goes all giddy, she goes all small, she goes all silly, she goes all like very cute. So anxious behaviour then, it's got some flexibility depending on the circumstance and situation. And we also might bring a bunch of coping skills or habits that we've learned, things that have maybe helped us out in that situation before. So if it's worked before, then we might do it again. But here's the important bit. The more intense the threat, the more likely the threat, the less flexible behaviour is. The more the threat activates our sympathetic nervous system with all of those lovely freeze, flight, fight behaviours, the less flexibility there is in fear behaviours. So that makes sense, right? So let's just give that an example, that if you're afraid you're going to get broken into, your house is going to get robbed, you might alter your behaviour. So you might get, maybe you get some lights that come on when you're out. You might get security cameras and things that you can check in with. You might get apps, you might get smart lights. You might alter where you keep your valuables. You might join Neighbourhood Watch, for instance. You might ask your neighbour to send you a text message if anything suspicious hangs on. You might even get a dog. But being concerned that something might give us scope to practice a lot of avoidance behaviours, all of those things are avoidance behaviours to avoid us getting robbed, they can be pretty flexible, they can be really inventive. But I think those will be very different if a burglar actually did get into your home whilst you're there. Even with your enormous and wonderful human brain and all of the inventiveness and all of the behavioural flexibility, all of the problem solving, all of the ingenuity that humans bring to the table, that our behaviours will be more restricted with that burglar in the house than when they're just a distant threat. So the closer the threat gets, the less flexible our behaviour is. So if they're just testing the doors and windows, I might be calling for backup, I might be calling the police, I might be getting my grandmother's big iron candlesticks, candlestick holders out, I might be hiding in the closet. There's still some room for variety in there. Or I might also be making a lot of noise to deter them if I think that kind of behaviour would work. But what I wouldn't be doing is carrying on painting my nails there. I wouldn't be doing that. So if we're doing something in the bedroom, say we're lagging the pipes in the cupboards, we're not going to be doing that behaviour if we think there's a burglar in the house. So fear limits and restricts behaviour, and panic even more so. When that threat is up close and personal, when that burglar is outside the closet where you're hiding and they're right there and they're just about to open it and discover you and nab you maybe, you're not going to be getting your tea set out or painting your nails or lagging the pipes, asking them if they'd like 1 lump or 2 in their tea. So the closer a threat, the more limited our behavioural repertoire. And that's where we get very inflexible behaviours. Of all the behaviours that we might do on a daily basis, we think of that as a repertoire of behaviours. Only a handful, when we're really afraid, are now an option. So that we see that where anxiety might have some flexibility, depending on how far away the threat is and what kind of circumstance it is, how likely the threat is going to be, we also know that the closer the threat gets, the more imminent that threat is, the less flexibility we see in our behaviour. That reduction in flexibility, that also cuts across all kinds of different situations. If I felt really afraid of my friend Claire, that would also limit my behaviours too. So sometimes we might feel anxious, but if we really can't escape the situation, if we really can't do anything about it, we might then force ourselves to engage, to interact, to find out if strangers really are potential allies or if they're potential foes. We're trying to get more information when we're anxious. Our behaviour changes in social situations, and so we get that flexibility there. So whilst I might go out of my way to avoid a spider in the bathroom, as long as I can, if I know that spider's there, social situations are a little bit different, especially for our dogs, where they're relying on sometimes a different set of behaviours altogether. So anxiety, fear and panic, they progressively reduce the flexibility of behaviours the closer the threat gets. So if you think about that spider in the bathroom, when you've got distance, when you're on the far side of the bathroom and you've got time, you're not in a rush, but you know that spider is there, you've got space for flexibility, you can choose to do some different things. You might ask someone to come in and remove them. You might carry on your day without even thinking about that spider sitting there waiting for you in the bathroom. You've got flexibility there. You might go and eat your lunch, not even thinking about the spider. You might be reading a book. You might be going in the garden, carrying on doing your normal day, watching some normal TV. But the more urgent it gets that you go to the bathroom, because say you need the toilet, or you stink so badly that you simply just can't get away without showering for another day and using a spider in the bathroom as an excuse, your anxiety, your proximity to the thing that you're afraid of, they're going to really alter how you do things, and we're going to see less and less flexibility in behaviour. So, not to get personal, but if you are the kind of person who enjoys a leisurely pee, and who isn't, or even a little light reading on the toilet, maybe it's just 5 minutes in the bathroom away from your kids, maybe it's a break from your boss. If there's a spider in there that you're really afraid of and it's sitting right next to you, you're probably going to change your behaviour. You might speed up, you might not be able to go. Maybe, and again, no judgment, you might even get a little stage fright and not be able to go to the toilet at all because your sympathetic nervous system's kicked in. No business, whether number 1 or number 2, no way. You'll be as fast as you can if you can do it, and it's the exact same thing with things like the shower or other activities that you might do in the bathroom. Maybe normally you'd be a shower diva. You're singing your way through a full repertoire of Freddie Mercury classics as you steam your pores, you condition your hair, you're making yourself beautiful, and you're escaping from all your other duties maybe. But if you stick something you're afraid of in the shower with you, perhaps not Norman Bates from Psycho, maybe just a friendly spider, but you'd probably be not quite so bothered about following the time instructions on your hair mask or whatever it is that you're doing in the shower. So the more afraid we are, the more limited our behaviour becomes, the more limited that repertoire of behaviours is. Up close and personal with the things that really, really scare us, whether that's sharks or spiders in the shower, there's literally nothing else we can do other than freeze, try to escape, or do our best to fight them off and get out there with minimal damage to ourselves. So whilst anxiety in general, it depends on like how close we are to the thing that we're afraid of. Like the closer we are, the less flexibility. The further away, the more flexibility. But the more imminent the risk, the less flexibility there is in behaviour. And the same is absolutely true for our dogs. Absolutely true. So frustration though, that moves a little differently. That's got its own time scale. And there can be a lot more variation at different points in frustration. So frustration is, after all, the mother of invention. So we might expect to find some variety in there. But we can think of frustration behaviours falling into 4 loose categories. And those categories are these: persist, invent, displace, quit. So persisting means that you keep doing the one behaviour that works for you in the past. So if that was getting a spider out of the bathroom and calling your dad got that, then that would be the behaviour you do. If bum rushing another dog is your way of reducing anxiety about that social interaction, then you're going to try to do exactly that. And if that's your A1 coping strategy and it's been your most effective, most successful behaviour in the past, it's like usually worked, then you're going to do that. And frustration is going to give us the impetus to persist. So I had a problem with my phone yesterday. I couldn't access my messages and that was pretty frustrating. So what did I do? I did what has always worked for me in the past. First I checked for my updates. They always tell us that, don't they? And then I restarted my phone because they always tell us to do that as well. So guess how many times I did that because I still couldn't get into my messages when it restarted. I did that 5 times because I'm quite a persistent person, as you could probably imagine. And this is especially true where that's worked in the past. And restarting my phone, that's worked in the past. But this time it didn't. To persist any further though, to do it 7 or 8 times, I would have been silly. It wasn't working for me. But either way though, we can see with those persistence behaviours at the beginning of the frustration cycle, those try the one you normally do behaviours, they're not very flexible at all. In fact, they can be quite rigid and our dogs can get quite stuck in those. So some dogs get really stuck here and they persist long past the point of no reward. It's not surprising though, because we've bred a lot of dogs for their persistence behaviours, and I'm kind of going, my dog is persistent, why is that? Having a greyhound who gave up and didn't persist when the hair started running would be a pretty useless greyhound. Having a terrier who said, not today, Bob, if you go to ask them to sort out your rat problem in the barn or under the roof, that would also be pretty useless. So we've selected dogs for their persistence. But many of our dogs get stuck with persistent behaviours, that very limited repertoire of one behaviour, when they're frustrated, and where we might see very little variation at all other than in intensity, in duration, in frequency, or in rate. Like our dogs might just do more, or they might do it bigger, or they do it longer, or they do it more often. So after persistence, we then switched to invention. So thinking back to my phone problem, I just got a little inventive with my message problem, and it's not very inventive. I went online, and this was quite frustrating because there were a lot of wrong things on the internet that needed correcting, or things telling me to persist a little bit longer when I'd already persisted and that had already failed. But eventually I hit the solution that worked for me. So somebody had said on the internet, uninstall and reinstall the app in the App Store. I was assured that I wouldn't lose all my messages because I was a little bit anxious about that, and I used my amazing human brain to do top 20-25 humaning. It worked. Goal achieved. And inventiveness is where we can see lots of unexpected, lots of unpredictable flexibility, lots of variation. And this is going to depend on our learning history as well. So sometimes we're going to do a thing that works elsewhere and we're just going to apply it in just new circumstances. So if ringing my brother worked, then that's what I would do. Or we might cycle back to a behaviour that might have worked for us in the past. Humans, that we are, of course, the masters of inventiveness. That's our special skill, our special sauce, thanks to language and culture. But we can really see inventiveness in our dogs as well. I've certainly seen that. I think huskies, they tend to be very inventive. Like, try a different approach. So I was thinking about buying a new phone. That was another way I was thinking of being inventive. I was checking out online deliveries. I was checking out shops where I could go in store and trial them and see which one I liked. I did think about calling a friend. I also checked out a tech company that's in the local village. I definitely have roped in like a bunch of other behaviours if what I did didn't work. So our inner barometer of frustration, it also tells us when it's time to move on, when that time. So if I was really struggling to find that right information on the internet, I'd have given up more quickly. When we start exhausting our inventiveness and when our persistence hasn't worked, it's not unusual to find this then tipping over into irritability. You can imagine me yesterday, the air was blue, and redirected anger. So thank goodness my phone issue resolved itself, because I am a dreadful human being if I have to speak to an actual poor person working in a call centre that is charged with solving my woes. But once we start seeing the same in our dogs, when we see that in our dogs and we can't miss it, particularly if they don't recognise that now is a really good time to move on or back away, it's here that we sometimes find variety and flexibility that then shut down again. So all of that inventiveness just then stops, where our attempts to have our needs met, whatever we tried, whatever our needs may be, if those needs are constantly thwarted and we can't get what we want, we're likely to see that behaviour shut down again. So the next stage of frustration is displacement. Like, we still need the thing, but we know we're not getting it in persisting or in inventing new ways. We're not getting it in the ways that we would be doing. And this is where we might then move on. So displacement literally means that we displace, we look elsewhere. We move away from the source of our frustration. So we might find somewhere else to go and see how we can get our needs met, because our frustration isn't getting us anywhere, our goals are not being achieved. So there can be an awful lot of flexibility in the behaviours we see in displacement as well, and a lot of crossover with anxiety there too, especially when we think about displacement behaviours in dogs. They are bound by frustration and anxiety. So it depends again on the situation and our goal, but what we do when we displace as a coping mechanism, how we let go of our frustration, because that's what displacement is about, letting go. It's also got a learning history. I am particularly good at displacement cleaning. That is my coping strategy for when I'm not getting my needs met. I go and clean. I go on a cleaning rampage. I have just done it before. The vacuum is out. I'm using all of that energy to just target something else, to target something different, knowing that I'm probably really not going to be very good on a call. So I might even cycle back to things I've done before, try out behaviours again, persist, invent again, and then displace again. So displacement is how we begin to regulate our frustration, and that can be filled with individuality, it can be filled with our learning history, it can be filled with what we've learned. We might turn to self-soothing, we might send our energies elsewhere, like me on my cleaning spree. So we might also switch goals at that point, that we might try and get our needs met in another way. So thinking back to my phone problem, why I needed messages was I wanted to order something online. That was my real frustration. And the company wanted to send me a text message. So that was my real problem. So I might have tried then a different company where I could order the products from, or tried a different way to access it, or maybe I could have called their hotline. So where persistence only has variety in terms of the factors that share that single behaviour, like intensity, there's variety in the intensity, the duration, the frequency, the rate. We don't see very much flexibility there. Invention and displacement can have a lot of variety and a lot of flexibility. So our final suite of frustration is quitting. It doesn't mean our goals have been met. Quitting doesn't mean our goals have been met. That's far from it, in fact. Our goals have not been met when we quit. but we realise that nothing we do is working. Persisting, not working. Inventing, not working. Displacing, not working. And we are out of solutions, so we just quit. And that tends to be fairly identical in most situations. But what we pick up following quitting might obviously depend on our secondary needs or alternatives or things that we've done in our past to help us cope with, to help us regulate frustration. So what we see is that anxiety might have flexibility up to a point. Frustration is designed to harness flexibility, to be more flexible, particularly in those middle stages after persistence. Those middle stages of inventiveness and displacement are places of a lot of flexibility and variety. So finding other ways to get our needs met, that's a mammalian forte. We are particularly good at it, and the more complex our biology, the more complex our behaviour, the more complex our cognition, the better we get at it. And that means there can be a lot of variety, a lot of inventiveness, a lot of flexibility in certain stages of frustration, especially if what we normally do doesn't work. So I got full on creative with my internet searches when I wasn't finding the answer that I wanted, and that's our particularly human strength. What this doesn't do, of course, is resolve the difference, though, in my member's question between anxiety and frustration. Is there more flexibility in anxiety or frustration, particularly if we're frustrated because something is impeding the way that we would normally resolve or reduce our anxiety. So it actually causes anxiety when we can't resolve our frustration. So normally if we would bum rush another dog to reduce our anxiety and our concern about them, and today we've got an enormous great big fat lead flipped on us that is preventing us from doing exactly that, then we might see more variety than we might normally expect, knowing that our dog is anxious in that situation. So in that repertoire of anxious behaviour, because of the bit of frustration there, we might see more variety. But the closer the threat becomes, the more likely it is that anxiety will switch to fear or to panic, in which case all that variety is no longer required. Like, we don't need variety when we escape from harm or to reduce harm. If that's our only goal, to reduce harm, we don't need variety. So we tend to find that behaviour follows much more orderly patterns when animals are genuinely afraid of an imminent attack. When they're afraid of something imminent about to happen, when it's really proximal, we're going to see lots less variety. So it's really fascinating, I think, to think of the behaviours that accompany different emotion states and the kind of things, the kind of categories of behaviours that we might see. If I suspect if a dog is feeling anxious or frustrated, both emotions also increase the risk of aggression or also unpredictable behaviours that I hadn't considered. So the more frustration is involved, the more unpredictable it might be. So I tend there to tread with caution, because the last thing I want is a dog learning that snapping or biting, aggressive behaviours, that they work really well, or stumbling also on behaviours that my tiny mind hadn't even contemplated might work. We humans are unfortunately really, really good at creating persistent, resilient behaviours in frustrated dogs. Yes, experts at that, because we didn't realise just how problematic it would be to try to get rid of those behaviours in the first place once we'd created them. So the more we understand and the more we observe dogs, though, the better we get at understanding them. The more we recognise where there's flexibility, or maybe where there's persistence, or maybe we see that limitation as they become more afraid. And where we see these, it can then help us make choices that then support our dogs better. So when I see limitations in flexibility, I'm starting to be a little concerned, because none of us want our dogs to feel uncomfortable levels of anxiety or frustration. None of us want to see that, do we?